Okay, hi again, everyone. We're going to get started. I am Patrice Rankin, Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Richmond. I want to thank all of you for joining us again this evening, which is part of a series of conversations that we've had sponsored in the School of Arts and Sciences called Responding to Two Pandemics. The series was conceived within the context of the summer of 2020 and the global COVID-19 pandemic, but also the racial unrest that ensued and that revealed the disparate experiences of people living within the United States. For the school, 2021 is actually our 30th anniversary, and we wanted to celebrate the year by doing the work of an excellent college of liberal arts, which is that of educating students for leadership in a complex world. As educators dedicated to the life of the mind, we learn as our students learn. And this series in our 30th year has been a great example of how this community of learners engages in thoughtful inquiry. Along with the series, we launched a special research award in the fall and spring for students who themselves, in their research and artistic production, were responding to the pandemics. So tonight, I want to take a moment to announce the second round winners, as we did last semester for the first round winners. So I'll say the students' names, the title of their papers, followed by the names of their research mentors. First, Bronson McLeod, who worked with the Bonnier Juvenile Correctional Center Finance Club on financial literacy education via storytelling, mentored by Terry Dolson and Andrea Simpson. Sabrina Duarte and Jayi Du, the effects of health interventions and social injustices on community outcomes, understanding the COVID-19 pandemics. And this was directed by Professor Joanna Wares. Next, we have Virginia Sun, The Racialization of Public Housing, a comparative case study of the city of Richmond and Stockholm under the guidance of Professor Jennifer Erkelwater. Grace Schuhal, How Accessible is COVID-19 Testing in Richmond, Virginia? This was directed by Professor Patricia Herrera. Sam Puglisi and TJ Anderson, Racial Disparities in College Students' Scholastic Adjustment Amidst COVID-19, the Protective Function of Campus Resources and Support, directed by Professor Karen Kokel. Julia Britton, Racism and the Social Determinants of Health Underlying Risk for Preterm Birth in Black American Women. Rick Mays was the faculty director of this project. And last but not least, once again, Jayi Du, this is your second award, and Iwe Sun, Impact of Online Learning on International Students' English Language Concerns. And this was directed by Leslie Bohan. I wanted to thank the Undergraduate Research Committee for reviewing the applications and Professor Monica Siebert for chairing the committee during this very active time and for working with the Dean's Office to make these awards possible. As you can tell from the titles and the scope of the projects, this is really evidence of the broad-based liberal arts education that our students are gaining. And I want to thank Laura Krajewski as well and Alumni Relations for their help in launching and working through these webinars. So congratulations to all of the awardees and to the faculty mentors. As you know, the School of Arts and Sciences prioritizes support for research students and student research. We do this, for example, through the Richmond Guarantee, which provides the initial summer research and support or the initial internship for our students. As the two pandemic awardees demonstrate, we are also able to support student research and in better times, their travel to conferences. We are grateful to alumni and other donors who make this work possible. Later this spring, the University of Richmond will hold You Are Here, our third annual Giving Day. And I would like to ask you to consider giving a gift to the School of Arts and Sciences or to one of the departments within the school. If you wish to support arts and sciences now or in the meantime, you may also visit giving.richmond.edu. The 2 pandemic series and the student awards are evidence of the work that your contributions are doing in the school. We are very, very grateful to alumni, parents, and friends who make this work possible. Thank you so much for your generosity. Now, turning to our topic for tonight. While we absolutely wish that we could be together in person, please view tonight's talk, tonight's lecture and conversation really as a virtual town hall. This is such an important topic. So please feel free to use the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. Ask your questions there. Any questions that you might have for the speaker, and we'll incorporate as many of these as possible at the end of the program. So I'll introduce the context and the speaker. She'll speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. She and I will engage in question and answer, a little back and forth for about 10 minutes. There are questions I have for clarification that I think will help the audience. And then we'll open up the conversation to you for your questions. So, and feel free to ask questions while we're having our conversation as well. So regarding the topic and the context, just yesterday, an article was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education titled "Race on Campus: Why Faculty Diversity Remains Largely a Zero-Sum Game." The article showed that over the last decade, the number of Asian faculty increased by just over 3%, Hispanic or Latino by less than 2%, and Blacks by less than a percentage point. Diversity by these numbers is a zero-sum game because the gains are minuscule over time, having perhaps very little broader social impact, some might argue, if that were in fact the goal of diversity. And the article argues that in fact what campuses are doing are poaching faculty from one campus to the next, not really increasing numbers. One way I would frame the discussion tonight as someone who is a manager in higher education might be to ask, if you poured millions of dollars into an endeavor over, let's say, 40 years, and your key performance indicators barely budged, would you keep doing it? Or at the very least, how would you go about reforming what you're doing for better impact? So in the bleakest formulation, this is the state of affairs. Though there have been many landmark cases that help to define diversity, beginning with Regents of the University of California versus Bakke Supreme Court decision in 1978, which certainly underlies the work we do on college campuses today. But how we go about addressing diversity also depends on what we are trying to achieve. And this question is precisely the area where Professor Warikoo's work is extraordinarily illuminating. When it comes to students, we know that the most marginalized are seeing staggering impacts as a result of the latest crisis over the last year. We saw a decrease in student enrollment in the fall, particularly as it pertains to students who would increase diversity on campus, to say nothing of the question of what role colleges and universities should play in being social and opportunity equalizers. Last week, the Chronicle also reported an alarming trend, the number of Latino first-year students tumbling by 20%, according to the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. This framework, or the frameworks really of thinking that Professor Warikoo gives us, help to really get at how students are themselves experiencing college campuses and the role that diversity might play for them. What is diversity actually achieving? So we turn to Professor Natasha Warikoo, who is Professor of Sociology at Tufts University. She is another example of our broad-based liberal arts education. She has a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Brown University, a Bachelor of Art in Philosophy. She went on to graduate degrees at Harvard in education, also at Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. She has a master's, a PhD in sociology from that institution as well. Two very exciting books that she's working on now include one tentatively, I suppose, titled Good Parents, Bad Parents: Asian Americans, Whites, and the Quest for Excellence in Suburban America. And another book under contract is Affirmative Action Fair. Her book from 2016 that really drew us into wanting to talk to her today is published by the University of Chicago Press, and it's called The Diversity Bargain and Other Dilemmas of Race, Admissions, and Meritocracy at Elite University. And it illuminates how undergraduates attending Ivy League universities and Oxford University conceptualized race and meritocracy. The book won multiple awards, including honorable mention for the Oliver Cromwell Cox Best Book Award from the American Sociological Association section on race and ethnic minorities, honorable mention for the Eduardo Bonilla Silva Book Award from the Society for the Study of Social Problems Division on Race and Ethnic Minorities, and from the American Educational Studies Association. In 2017 and 2018, Professor Warikoo was a Guggenheim Fellow studying racial change in suburban America. So please join me. I know that if you were in the audience, you would give an applause. So please join me in virtual applause for Professor Warikoo, and we will hear from her now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Patrice, for that kind introduction. And it's really great to be here. And thank you for the invitation. Just hearing those student projects was really exciting. It sounds like some really great work being done at the university. And I will say that, you know, these are always bittersweet. On the one hand, the virtual format enables people from kind of far and wide to come to these conversations. And on the other hand, one of my favorite things when I give a talk in person is to have the chance to get to know, go to dinner or lunch with colleagues and students. I would have loved to meet some of those students whose projects you mentioned. It sounds like they're just doing really amazing things at the college. So here we are. So I wanna, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so I was very excited when Patrice told me the title of this seminar, Diversity Helping or Harming Us, because in my book, The Diversity Bargain, I really tried to get at this question of the ways that we talk and think about diversity. And I'll just say a little bit about, you know, Patrice mentioned the kind of devastating impact of the current pandemic and the economic downturn, particularly on underrepresented students in higher education. But what I want to talk today about is, at the same time, we're seeing huge increases in applications to elite colleges. So there's this real bifurcation going on. And in this project, I really focused on the elites. And I'll say a little bit in a moment about why I chose to do that. This book is about how undergraduates at elite colleges in the US and in Britain understand race, college admissions, and meritocracy, this idea that, you know, the quote unquote most meritorious students will get selected for these elite colleges. So I argue in this book that the way that we teach students to think about race and college admissions and diversity more broadly actually does damage to efforts to reduce inequality and to promote interracial dialogue. And I'll explain why as we go forward. And what I'm particularly interested in is how we might shift the ways that we address race, class, achievement, and diversity to more accurately reflect the opportunity structure of our society today and our racial realities. And for me, what I really care about is shaping those perspectives in more productive ways so that these young people, who many of whom will go on to be leaders in society and have a lot of decision-making power, will make decisions that promote greater racial justice. Okay, so let me just start out by giving you a little bit of background about what's the state of the United States. Since over the last, say 30, 40 years, the United States has been dramatically increasing in inequality. So this graph just shows you the percentage of the total income in the United States taken home by the top 1%, that's the red line, and the bottom 50%, that's the blue line. And as you can see, the share of the bottom 50% is dramatically declining and the top 1% is dramatically increasing. And so, you know, we have growing economic inequality in the United States. And when we change this to kind of post-tax income and, you know, post-redistribution, it doesn't look dramatically different. Now, we are unequal, and lest we think that this is just the way modern societies are, it's not. So if we compare the United States to other OECD countries that are similarly well off, we see this. So I'll explain this chart. This chart on the horizontal axis gives you a measure of something called the Genie Coefficient. The Genie Coefficient is just the ratio of people. If you line up everybody's income from lowest to highest, people at the 90th percentile divided by the incomes at the 10th percentile. That's your Genie coefficient. So the higher the coefficient, the higher the spread of incomes in your society. And so you can see the United States is higher on inequality, income inequality, than all of France, Germany, Spain, etc., all of these countries, and surpassed really only by emerging economies. And then the vertical axis on this graph is a measure of what we call intergenerational earnings elasticity. All that means is the correlation on average between what a person earns and what their parents earned. So, you know, we would want there to be no correlation, that it doesn't matter what your parents' income was, that's not related to what your income is. So ideally, intergenerational earnings elasticity would be 0. You know, if we had complete status reproduction, that is, you earn whatever your parents earn, it would be 1. So if you care about equity, you want it to be lower. And again, you can see that the United States is higher than all of these other comparable countries. So, and that there's a relationship. The more unequal a society, the harder it is to experience social mobility. So it's important to understand that this didn't have to be the case, that we are we don't need to be this unequal. And in fact, comparable countries are not that unequal. And because of this inequality, I became particularly interested in how inequality is maintained by those who are advantaged. So often when we think about inequality, we think about those who are disadvantaged, and there's good reason for that. But I think it's also important to pay attention to those people at the top, that top 1%. What role do they play in maintaining inequality? So that led me to this project. It led me to this question: how do elites make sense of their accomplishments in a highly unequal society? And so I decided to study students at the most elite colleges. And so me and my research team gathered interviews with undergraduates attending 2 Ivy League colleges in the US, Harvard and Brown, and then 1 in the UK, Oxford. I won't talk about the Oxford findings today, just in the interest of time, and I'm happy to do so later. But I was really curious about how elites make sense of their accomplishments when they know that with their accomplishments, and how do they reconcile that with inequality in society? How do they make sense of the racial inequality in particular? And I thought this would give us clues as to why we continue to have social policies that perpetuate inequality and make us, you know, further on that graph than other comparable countries. Okay. So, and just to keep in mind, so we know that there is inequality in Ivy League student bodies. So this data changes from year to year. This was the data during the year that I was doing this research. You can see Black and Latinx students are underrepresented. First generation college students are also I should say non-first generation students are overrepresented, this data shows, compared to young adults in the United States. So we know that the outcome of admissions is unequal. And the question is, how do students make sense of that? On the one hand, they feel like they've accomplished something. They've earned it through meritocracy. On the other hand, the process creates these unequal outcomes. So I wanted to kind of help get a sense of how they made sense of that. So my research team and I interviewed students on these 2 campuses, white students and students of color. And then some other kind of observational and kind of more informal conversations. Today I'm going to speak about mostly about the responses from the white students, because in the interest of time, and because this group in many ways is the one that is the most privileged, right? White students on these elite college campuses. And again, you know, I think just as I think it's important to study the top 1% to understand inequality, I also think it's important to study whites as if we're interested in understanding race in the United States and racial inequality. Okay, so we asked a bunch of questions related to college admissions. One of them was related to affirmative action, and that's the one I'm going to focus on today. And we said simply, affirmative action is kind of a hot button issue, and I didn't want to raise sort of people's emotions. So we just asked a general question. Should your college consider race or ethnicity in admissions? Very open-ended. And it turns out that a majority of the American students support affirmative action, and more of them support it than other adults in the United States. So this question about affirmative action is often on political opinion surveys in the United States. Students were much more in favor of it than kind of the average American adult. So if you're a supporter of affirmative action like me, that's good news. They said things like, these are all pseudonyms. The student I called Elliot, he said, we asked, should your college consider race or ethnicity in admissions? And Elliot said, I didn't think so before I got here. And now I think so because, and I think so now because different groups of people, I had a better experience because they provided me with insight that I otherwise wouldn't have. Now there's a whole, there's a whole research literature to back up Elliot's view that diversity enhances his learning experience. Research shows that diversity will not only improve his racial attitudes, but also develop his cognitive capacity, his future civic participation. The list kind of goes on. So that's the good news, that we know that diversity has a positive impact, and he is recognizing that impact. Another student said, I think diversity adds as much to the class as somebody who's a world-class piano player, and it's just a different sort of diversity to add. You can start to see here kind of a similar narrative about bringing something to campus, some kind of contribution, but kind of maybe perhaps somewhat puzzling or maybe troublesome kind of quantification or objectification of someone's racial identity. But again, this idea that diversity is a thing that is to be kind of something to that one gains from, right? You hear good music in the orchestra through the piano player, you learn about different perspectives from underrepresented minority students. However, the problem with this framing is that there was little recognition of racial inequality in these students' perspectives. So white students rarely mention the reason that affirmative action was instituted in selective colleges in the first place back in the 1960s, which was to address racial inequality. And in fact, most students, especially white students, had a hard time making sense of racial inequality. They supported it basically exclusively because of benefits to themselves that they perceived through this diverse learning environment. So again, you might think, so what if they don't acknowledge racial inequality? At least they're supportive of affirmative action. Again, if you support affirmative action. But this justification, absent an understanding of racial inequality in American society, had some troubling consequences. And the consequences led to what I call the diversity bargain. And that is that white students support affirmative action because of personal benefits. And this led them to three expectations. I'm going to talk about these three elements now. So the first one is what I call the integration imperative. That is that if affirmative action, so often it was assumed that all Black and Latinx students on campus were there because benefited from affirmative action in the admissions process, which we know some quantitative studies suggest that that's obviously not true for all students. But there's an assumption that they were there because of affirmative action. And then the bargain was that, well, if you're there and you benefited, then you need to integrate at all times in order to hold your end up of the bargain and enlighten white peers. So, that proverbial question, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? This was a complaint, right? Because that was not serving that integration purpose if they were all sitting together. So here's a student I call Anna. She said, I think that Harvard is a pretty diverse place, but I think the diversity ends up being a lot of different groups that sort of self-select and associate within their particular culture. I don't know that there's much interaction between the different groups. And she went on, it really bothers me because it makes it really difficult to get to know people because I'm not in any of those. Like, I'm not going to join the Black Students Association. And most of the groups that I'm in are not. And I think she means race defined here. Because if they had a White Students Association, they'd probably get in a lot of trouble. And then finally, she said, I think it's just sort of sad because the interaction that I have had with people from different backgrounds has been so great for me. And especially coming from a school where there wasn't a lot of that, which means a high school there. So again, there's three things that I want you to take away from Anna's words. First is, again, like others, she sees the benefits of integration. But then perhaps more troubling is that she equates a Black Students Association with a White Students Association. Suggesting that she doesn't quite understand the purpose of a Black Students Association on a predominantly white campus and why that might be different than a White Students Association. And again, absent an understanding of racial inequality, it's hard to make sense of why those two kinds of groups would be different. And the last thing to notice is that she says that she's not going to enter into Black dominant spaces, right? She's not going to join the Black Students Association or, go to that table of mostly Black kids. I guess they're not kids, sorry, students in the cafeteria, right? But she expects her Black peers to enter into the white dominated spaces at all times, right? And again, that lack of understanding of racial inequality prevents Anna from understanding why a Black Students Association may be so critical as for some Black students as a space for support and for to be around people with shared experiences, even if at all other times in your classes in the dorm you're in mixed environments. So that's the integration imperative. And I want to turn now to the second kind of consequence of this diversity bargain. The white students support affirmative action because of personal benefits, and this led some to what I call the reverse discrimination script. And this is this idea that white students may experience reverse discrimination because of affirmative action. And it's a script because students deployed it even when they hadn't necessarily experienced any kind of any situation in which they might have attributed to reverse discrimination. So, and so because affirmative action is supposed to benefit white students, then they don't think then it shouldn't, a kind of reverse discrimination situation contravenes that diversity bargain. So we asked all students, have there ever been instances in which you felt you'd experienced racial discrimination? And so Serena said, if I hadn't gotten into Harvard, I would have felt that I'd been discriminated against. If someone else that I knew who was equally qualified and who was a minority, if they'd gotten in over me. So again, I call this a script because Serena got into Harvard, arguably, one of the hardest universities to get into in the country. But that script is still in the back of her mind and ready to deploy. And you can imagine her going forward and applying to graduate school or an internship or a job, and maybe one of those competitive processes she's not successful. And then affirmative action is a quick target to kind of blame for not winning every competition. Okay, and the third consequence of the diversity bargain is that there were sometimes these kind of essentialized understandings of race and ethnicity. That is that if affirmative action is supposed to be, the purpose of it is supposed to expose white students to different perspectives, then and Black and Latinx students on campus were assumed to have benefited from affirmative action, then they needed to have had experiences that white students felt were sufficiently different to their own experiences so that they could be exposed. And those were often associated with urban poverty. And class-based disadvantage. So here's Karen. She said, I don't think because someone checked out the Black box or like the Latino box, that should be what helps get them in. So sorry, this was in response to the question about whether the college should consider race or ethnicity. Maybe in their interview, you find that like, since they're Latino, they've done all these things that make them add something different to the cultural fabric of Harvard. I know people who are like a quarter Mexican who got the Latino Scholars Award and their entire experience has been a white experience. So this kind of essentialized idea of what it means to be Latino leads Karen to, rather than the encounter with this peer leading her to expand her understanding of the Latino experience in the United States, which is incredibly diverse, that she says that she kind of rejects that person's identity as Latino, right? That, and whatever she defines as a kind of quote unquote white experience. So again, if diversity is supposed to contribute to this kind of cultural fabric and expose Karen to different class cultures or whatever she means by kind of the cultural fabric, then she rejects this form of affirmative action. She's not talking about admissions here. She's talking about an award, but this is in response to the same question. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, I didn't. Okay. So that was the third kind of unintended consequence of this way of talking about diversity exclusively as kind of in this kind of multicultural, diversity is great for everyone, language absent discussion of racial inequality. And I argue in the book that this diversity bargain is very much embedded in students' definitions of merit and of race, right? And what it means to be deserving of admission to Harvard, to Brown, to any elite college. That they sort of, as they think about race and meritocracy and fairness, this diversity bargain is sort of folded into that. And it's problematic because these expectations of students of color and beliefs about a supposed reverse discrimination can be harmful to students of color and to race relations on campus more broadly. And without an understanding of racial inequality, it seems pretty hard to address it and tackle it. These students are going to go on to be leaders in our society. They tend to be more elite. They're getting an Ivy League stamp behind their names. Some will become media commentators and shape the ways that we talk and think about race and fairness and meritocracy. Others will be policymakers and making decisions about, who is deserving of social supports, the stimulus. I'm sure there are a lot of elite college degrees out in Congress sort of making these big decisions about who's worthy of stimulus money, what are the requirements, and managers who are making hiring decisions. And again, who deserves to be hired and to be promoted in HR. And they'll take these understandings of race and fairness into their work. And it makes it hard for them to understand, I argue, racial violence, ongoing protests related to race. I think the protests of this summer, I think, has been a real reckoning. And, I'm hopeful that that will push the conversation in a way that hadn't yet happened when I was doing this research, when Black Lives Matter was relatively new. And the historical roots of white supremacy on the rise in the US today, that's become so troubling. Because if we can't understand how racial inequality is embedded in the very nature of our society, including college admissions, it makes it hard to take on these and really understand these tough issues. So I sometimes wonder if the concept of quote unquote diversity can sometimes do more harm than good and in our kind of push towards racial justice. It makes diversity palatable to whites, but palatable to whites, but at significant cost. Okay, so what do we do? So I just want to talk about, I'm a sociologist, but I come from education. I taught in a school of education for 10 years, and I was a former teacher. I don't like to stop with, okay, here's the analysis and the problem, but what can we do? I think it's really important to think about this. And so I want to just say a few implications of what I think needs to happen. First, I think, it's really important for all of us, and students to learn about and teach about racial exclusion, both historic and ongoing, especially in the 20th century. Whenever I get the ears of college administrators, I say we should have a diversity. We have so many requirements for students, distribution requirements. Why not a diversity requirement? Because I think, the narrative that we so often hear, kids so often hear in school, is that, they might hear, if they hear about race, they hear that there was this horrible thing called slavery, and that ended through the Emancipation Proclamation. Then we had this horrible thing called segregation, and that ended by the Civil Rights Movement. And now we are a kind of multicultural democracy. And I think that that really excludes a lot of what's happened even in the 20th century, when supposedly colorblind policies have systematically excluded African Americans from the American dream. We don't learn about Native American displacement, about the impact of parents' undocumented status on their children. And so, you know, just to give you one example, it related to higher education, the GI Bill. This is a bill that provided scholarships to GIs coming back from World War II at a time, you know, this 1950s, late 40s, early 50s, time of great higher education expansion in the United States. But that bill did not include a non-discrimination clause, and so colleges could discriminate. And so African Americans came back and they couldn't avail of these, they couldn't get entree into a lot of the colleges, and were forced to go to historically Black colleges and universities that didn't have the capacity to take on all of these students who wanted to come. And so a lot of them were shut out from that engine of social mobility. Policies of redlining, you know, that maintained residential segregation, and you know, the list goes on. And it means that, you know, when we understand that history, we understand, for example, that the child of 2 Black doctors and the child of 2 white doctors are likely to have different lived circumstances. The child of white doctors is much more likely to have inherited generations of wealth, versus the other child to be, you know, one or 2 generations out of poverty, with social networks in which they might be supporting relatives. And so there are so many ways in which race continues to play a role aside from whatever coincidence it has with class. And I think it's really important for young people to understand this. And we often don't teach how this has happened in our society. I think we've really failed to come to terms with this history. And this really, in my mind, this is incredibly important as I see the growing divide in this country. Okay, the second thing I think, as we think about higher education in particular, is to create what my former student, Janine Denevais, calls creating brave community in classrooms. So Janine did this study in which she observed 2 classes on race and the ways that faculty created community in order for students to facilitate deep discussion of race. And she talks about focusing on text as a way to do this. We need to create spaces on campus in which students engage with each other. And this is increasingly hard. We are increasingly polarized. But I feel like if we can't get this right in higher education, then, you know, I don't know what we're going to do, but I feel like we can be a model for society to get this right. And I'm hopeful that we can do this. Third, I think, you know, using language related to equity and justice and diverse leadership, not just diversity as a kind of generic term, for all of the reasons that I described earlier. Fourth, hire diverse faculty. I think this faculty of color are more likely to be able to address these issues. I think it also, seeing faculty who look like them, fosters trust in students. And obviously it increases access for those faculty as well. And diversify the student body and support affinity groups for students of color, because we know that those affinity groups can play a crucial role in helping students be successful on campus and in those social support networks. Consider a lottery in admissions. You know, this idea that certain people are more deserving than others of admission, when in fact there's so many amazing young people in this country that colleges that are selective should say, okay, here's our bar, you know, if you can, whatever that is, if you can meet certain criteria, let's just have a lottery. Because the truth is that we treat college admissions as something that we've achieved, but a lot of it is a lottery. Did we get the right mentoring? Did our parents have money to pay for, you know, private lessons so we could, you know, develop our extracurricular talents? Did we have a writing coach so we could write that great essay and not have any grammatical mistakes? All of these things are not related to, you know, us as individuals, but rather the kind of world around us. And a lottery would sort of make that clear. And lastly, I would say just recognize that meritocracy is never complete in an unequal society. So if you remember that graph that shows that the more unequal incomes are in a country, the less social mobility you see across generations. And so in our unequal society, we need to recognize that and really implement, and not just put all our eggs in the meritocracy basket. We need to support broad social supports for people who are low income, poor, so that we have less inequality overall, which will increase equity as well. Okay, so I am going to stop here. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I really appreciate, on a weekday evening, I'm sure many of you have been on Zoom all day already. So I appreciate your time and attention to this work. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. Perhaps if you would want to, stop sharing, and then we can see each other. And yeah, wonderful, excellent. This was fantastic, just very stimulating. And we are already getting great questions, particularly one from one of our eminent sociologists on campus. So with that, before I even go there, I just want to kind of unpack a few things, especially for those coming from different disciplines. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about methodology. In the book. One of the things I talk to the students about all the time, and one of the things that we're really trying to develop, is this sense that people come at problems from different methodological frameworks, different habits of mind. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what sociology is bringing for you to the problem, what approach you took, things like the number of students that you interviewed, how you formulated questions, just to sort of broadly, if you could let us in a little bit into your methodology.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. So there's a lot of discussion in sociology about the best way to get at people's racial attitudes, right? Do we ask survey questions where people can be anonymous and then they don't feel like they have to give the socially correct answer? No, do you support affirmative action? Do you support or do we do in-depth interviews where we really allow people to talk through how they make sense of some of these issues? Some of the research suggests that in-depth interviews can kind of dig into these issues a little bit more. And for me, it's not an either or. There are some great surveys in higher education, the higher education HERI, and but I really wanted to understand something a little deeper that I couldn't get with just bounded survey questions, which was like, how do people make sense of what's a fair way of admitting students? How do students, we kind of gave students, beyond this question about affirmative action, we gave students the data. We said, and now I don't remember what the numbers were, but this percentage of students at your college are Black or Latinx. The percentage of Black or Latinx young people in the country is, I think it was around 50, at the time it was 15% versus 30%. How do you explain this difference? And then we asked, well, do you think it's a problem? And, if they said yes, well, do you think that universities should do anything about it? If so, what should they do? What should be done? And so really trying to dig deeper into people's ideas about fairness and race. So that kind of led me to in-depth interviews. Now, in my first book, and actually in the book that I'm writing right now, I did all of the in-depth interviews. But in this book, I was uneasy with interviewing white students about race, because I worried that as a person of color, they might not feel as comfortable sharing their perspectives. And so I decided to hire a white graduate student to do the interviews with white students. And then I thought, and then I was going to do the interviews with students of color. But then I worried also that, well, maybe that's unfair too. If someone else is doing the interviews with white students and I'm doing the interviews with students of color, I'll probably feel a lot more empathy and connection to those students of color because I met them in person, right? And so then I hired a student of color to do the interviews with students of color. And so we interviewed around 20 to 25 white students on both of the US college campuses, and 15 students of color on each of the campuses as well. And those 15 students were roughly divided between Asian American, Asian American, Black, and Latinx students. And I think we had one Native American student on one of the campuses. And we tried to be sort of broad in our recruiting. I didn't want to recruit students, for example, from any of the kind of multicultural student centers, because I knew that would be a particular group of students of color. So we did it by dorms, in these dorms that were like they were not specialized dorms anymore. They're just like random dorms. And we only interviewed upper class students because we wanted to be able to have the students talk about their university experience and how that shaped their ideas about race and merit. So that was the main, and then in the UK, we interviewed UK-born students of UK-born parents, all of whom were white, and then UK-born students, children of immigrants from outside the EU as the kind of second group. And so, part of the book, and I didn't talk about this today, was really trying to understand how these national contexts shape students' perspectives. Because one of the things that I noticed, because I lived in and worked in the UK for 6 years, was that higher education is very different there in the sense of very little talk about diversity at all, right? And little recognition of racial inequality and even class, right? And the kind of underrepresentation of students of color, working class students. And so I was curious about how higher education shapes students differently in these two very different national contexts. So that's your question.
Yeah, that's great. I'm wondering too, from someone outside of sociology, it sounds to me, some of what you're saying reminds me of sociological theories, and I'm wondering what theories were at play, maybe framing or informing your question. So for example, I think of things like inconspicuous consumption.
Yeah.
That diversity becomes a kind of commodity.
Yeah.
Sort of aspirational class ideas that this is something that people are kind of pocketing as part of who they are, part of their sort of value system.
Yeah.
I just wondered what was at play for you? What kinds of ideas?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, right, to kind of connect to. For me, I was really interested in kind of the study, the kind of thinking about elites. So I'm going to share, if you don't mind, this this slide, which I think is this the right one? Okay. So yeah, as I thought about this, I thought about the research on elites. So the power elite is a classic in sociology. C. Wright Mills, where he talks about, this was written in 1956. He talks about the kind of consolidation of economic, political, and military power in the United States, and the ways that the sort of bringing those elites together created this kind of elite class that was kind of running the country in a way that was problematic. And also, I think, again, it was this moment of like growing inequality that led to this sort of, how do we make sense of elite perspectives and how elites are reproducing privilege? And then, within the study of elites, this important question about the role of merit in either expanding opportunity or reproducing privilege. So in sociology, there's like, the sort of two kind of theories that we often think about is social reproduction, right? This idea that culture and ideas about meritocracy get used to reproduce class, right? Kind of in the kind of Marxist tradition, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, merit has been seen as a kind of model for modern society to move past the elitism of the past, right? And into the knowledge economy. So meritocracy, Daniel Bell suggested in the early 1970s, meritocracy was going to be our way into the future because, your social position was going to be based on your kind of your skill, right? Not determined by who your parents were. And in the end, I think what we find is that those ideas about meritocracy often get used to reproduce status, right? That to legitimate the status quo, and that was sort of Pierre Bourdieu's ideas. And so these are some of the ideas I was toying with: social reproduction, elites, and kind of the ways that culture and ideas about how status gets legitimated as fair and as earned rather than given to you. So that's the sort of kind of literature that I was sort of embedding.
Very, very helpful. Thank you for that. And I'm going to encourage the students on the call to send us questions, because we want to hear from you as well. One of the questions in the chat and the question and answer gets at something I was going to ask about the frames. You talk about the diversity frame and mostly sort of the response of white students. And Matthew Aware, who's one of our sociologists at UR, says that he wants to know, are there beliefs or thoughts vastly different? Are the beliefs and thoughts of students of color vastly different from the white students you discussed? If so, how? Can you briefly summarize the thoughts of the students who were Black, Latinx, American Indian, Asian American, who were part of your survey?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think in particular the Black and Latinx students didn't, as you might imagine, and shouldn't, in my view, subscribe to this diversity bargain, right? They didn't see their role on campus as, to educate their white peers, right? They were there to get an education just like everybody else. I think many of them did approach interracial interactions with caution, given experiences that they had had early on in their lives. And they talked about them, a teacher who said, well, I'm surprised to see you in this honors class, or very blatant sort of, experiences, and really kind of these pivotal moments that sort of made kind of racialization, clear to them. And, there's some devastating stories about the ways that race played a role in their early childhood, and so they came to campus just sort of hanging back and seeing, like, are people going to treat me with respect? Am I going to get singled out? Is everybody going to turn to me in class when the issue of race comes up? So that they did talk about that, and that was especially true of the Black and Latinx students. I think one thing to note is that in terms of this diversity frame and this appreciation for diversity, all the students of color also talked about this, right? That they also appreciated diversity. And I think students of color, it's interesting. Brown has this, I chose Brown and Harvard because Brown has a very different approach to diversity than Harvard. It has much more what I call, there are pieces of what I call a power analysis approach, which is a much more recognition of racial inequality. And they have this orientation program that's predominantly for students of color. And a lot of the white students were like, why do they all have to come and they all meet each other, they become friends, and then we don't have access to them. And the students of color were like, I went to this program and I made all of these cross-racial friendships, right? Because of course, students of color are incredibly diverse, right? Even Black students on campus are incredibly diverse. Asian students on campus are incredibly diverse. These identities are very diverse within them. So, and they appreciated that diversity and talked about it. But I think students of color were also more likely to espouse what I call the power analysis. So the power analysis frame is this idea that is looking at race through a lens of inequality, right? Which is what I'm kind of advocating. Most white students didn't do that. There were a handful who did. Students of color were more likely to recognize the role of racial inequality in American society that is separate from class inequality. So, some students would say, well, it's class, not race, right? And so, this was especially true of students of color who participated in this orientation program at Brown that I was talking about, and other institutions, even the Minority Student Center at Brown. At the time, was called the Third World Center, and now it's called the Brown Center for Students of Color. Was very much focused on that orientation program. When I saw the program, it was, workshops on sexism, racism, ableism. So very much putting front and center racial justice and inequality, rather than the Harvard Center is called the Harvard Center for Intercultural Affairs, Harvard Foundation for Intercultural Affairs. So you can see even in the name of the organization, much more focused on integration. Yeah, so that's a little bit about some of the students of color.
That's terrific. I was wondering about any evidence of switch in frames. Is that, you know, so you're talking about ways that the student frame, the kinds of things that Black students were thinking about in terms of social justice could possibly be a position or a frame of reference that a white student might develop.
Yeah.
Are you interested? Are you looking at this longitudinally? Are you going to go back and see, is there any work that you are thinking about doing that would help us to understand how or whether or when, what kinds of interventions might help for people to be able to switch their frames?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have this, you're giving me an opportunity to share all the slides that I had to take out. So
wonderful.
I hope you'll humor me.
We didn't plan this, you all. This is
you're not planted. You just, great minds think alike. These are the things that I'm kind of interested in too. So in the book, I talk about these different kind of race frames. I call race frames these sort of the lens, they're almost like glasses that we put on, the lens through which we understand the role of race in society, right? So there's a color blindness frame, which says that race doesn't play a role apart from any coincidence with class, right? So race doesn't, matter. We should all be color. I'm colorblind, right? You often hear this. Diversity is the diversity frame is the frame that I was talking about in my talk today, right? This idea that diversity is great, we should celebrate diversity. And interestingly, on the one hand, colorblindness and diversity seem like opposites. One is like, yay, like, let's really pay attention. And the other is, let's act like it doesn't exist. But what they both don't address is inequality, right? And the power analysis frame is a frame that looks at race through the lens of unequal groups in society. The culture of poverty, I didn't hear in the US much at all, which is this idea that minority groups have a culture that leads them to lower status in society. I heard that a little bit in the UK. So one of the things I talk about is how students' frames and this was retroactive, so we didn't look at this longitudinally, but there's some other research that I think speaks to this question but when they talked about how when they got to campus, they started out with this color blindness frame that they often learned in school, or the diversity frame, right? Oh yeah, we had international potluck at school when I was growing up, and this kind of celebration of diversity. But when they got to campus, often developed a much stronger diversity frame that, they would say, well, I didn't think it was a big deal. And then I got to campus and I realized how much diversity is important, and it really opened my eyes, and I realized how great it is that we have affirmative action and we have these students here who can shape my perspective. Some of the students of color talked about developing a power analysis frame through their college experiences. Again, this was much more likely students on the Brown campus who had gone to this third world transition program, this orientation program, and they said things like, I thought I was just coming to college, easing in, I'll meet some new people, and then my whole worldview was shattered, right? And they sort of really, the way they understand the world gets turned upside down, and they develop this power analysis frame. So the college experiences are definitely shaping these frames. And I talk about in this article, and I talk about this in the book, that these are not exclusive frames, right? So you might pick up the power analysis frame, but you still have that diversity, you still appreciate that diversity frame, right? That it still brings a richness to campus. And ironically, there were a lot of students who had both, who used a color blindness lens in some parts of their interview and a diversity lens in other parts. So yeah, they definitely changed.
Very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to put a couple of questions together. One person is asking a really spot on question about how do you frame so two together. One, how do you frame the need for social justice when it is a pejorative term for half of the United States population? And then in addition to that, when you think about the students of color, what were their feelings and thoughts about affirmative action? And did they feel that white students were viewing them as non-deserving? So again, this broader question having to do with how we address the fact that we're kind of, seeing this problem in very different ways across the United States.
Yeah. So the first question, how to frame racial justice. I have to say, I've gone back and forth with using this phrase, racial justice or social justice, because I would think that it's often a code word. I think it's a little bit of a code word for a certain kind of politics, a certain way of understanding the path towards racial equality. I think if you ask most Americans, do you believe in social justice, right? That idea that like we should live in a just society, justice for everyone, we should have racial justice, that we should have racial equity. Most people aren't going to agree. Perhaps the recent past might make us think not, but I think in general that there is shared, at least definitely more than half of Americans agree on this. But I think the problem is we agree that we want equity, but we're not very good at talking about how to get there, right? But when we start saying, okay, do you think we should, consider race in admissions so that we can get to there? That's when people are like, I don't know, maybe. Or do you believe in school integration? Yes, everybody has been saying yes for 20 or 30 or 40 years on these public opinion surveys. But when you asked, should there be busing to create integration in schools, then a lot of people will say no. So there's like, you want that, but then you're not willing to do the things that we need to do in order to get there. I think that's where the disagreement comes. But again, I really think I have a lot of faith in people, and young people in particular, that if you help them understand the roots of racial inequality and how we got here in the first place, I think it becomes an easier sell to say, look, this is how we got to where we are, right? It's not that people don't work hard. It's not that people don't care, don't, value education, right? If you look at surveys, people across racial lines value education, right? They aspire to education, but there are all these things that get in the way, and part of them is related to the history of the United States. And if people understand that, I think they would be more sympathetic. And then this question of the students of color, sorry, I wrote down, do they think that white students viewed them as less than worthy? I don't think I remember students saying that in particular. And I think they were not worried about that. I think, they felt like, I think there's two narratives, right? One narrative is like, well, you had it easier because you're, experienced affirmative action. Another narrative is like, you're from a group that's underrepresented on campus and you're here. You're like extra special, right? I think there's another narrative that can be said. And I think those students of color, I think they felt like they deserved to be there. But I think, but I also, this is just now more anecdotal that students of color, I think all students on elite college campuses at some point have, maybe not all, sorry, but a lot have this sort of anxiety of like, was I the admissions mistake? Or, can I keep up with these students who, went to a fancy boarding school or, had a better education than me? And there is some of that anxiety. But I think interestingly in the US, the students were more likely to kind of expect that the university would help them through, that they would kind of seek all of these institutions on campus to be able to support, to shepherd them through. And I think elite colleges in a way are able to do this more than because they have all of these resources. In the UK, there was more of a sense of like, maybe I don't belong here because I'm having a hard time. Maybe I should have gone to a different college. And so sort of these heartbreaking kind of conversations. But I think in the US, there's a shared culture of, supporting each other. I think the colleges have, we have a long way to go in higher education, but in the US, there is a somewhat of a commitment to supporting students who arrive to be successful.
Terrific. I'm going to put two together in the frame of income inequality and uncovering talent despite income inequality. One has to do with your process and research questions, and another has to do with your proposed solutions. So did your research ask about perspectives on income inequality among the students that you surveyed? Was that a frame of reference that was prominent for the research questions and in the students' responses? And then, do you know of any examples of the lottery process applied to a selective admissions process? It could be high school, could be college, or to a selective hiring process? And if so, what outcomes were achieved?
Yeah, great question. So we didn't ask students about income inequality. There is this great, maybe what I have a hard time searching and speaking. I'll try to dig up this video and put it in the chat. There's this great video that talks about a survey of Americans and what people think inequality looks like, and then what they think inequality should look like, which is less than what they think it is. But the reality is that we're actually more unequal than most people think we are, and even more unequal than we think people think we should be. So so on a kind of national level, I think Americans are, overall, we want less inequality and think we're less unequal. In terms of the lottery, this is something that I've written a little bit about. I just think part of the reason that I find it compelling is that it takes away this idea that this is a meritocratic process and that you got in because you deserved it. You know, yes, I'm sure that all of those, you know, almost all of the students who came to these colleges worked incredibly hard in high school, but what they don't realize is that they have had opportunities to work hard that other young people perhaps haven't, right? Because, you know, perhaps they were the star musician, but they, you know, they were able to be the star musician because their parents were able to pay for lessons and an instrument. And so, you know, we forget that working hard, it's almost like working hard is almost a privilege, right? And that, you know, that matters. But the lottery, so that's why I'm kind of very taken by this idea with the lottery. I think there's a few things that we can think about that are somewhat parallel. One is, it's not perfect, but admission to some of the charter schools that are required to be lottery based. And part of the problem with these lotteries, though, is that these schools often push out students who are not able to fit into their mold. I will say I'm very excited about, so Lowell High School in San Francisco is a high school that is, it's one of these kind of elite exam schools. And in Virginia, you have the governor's schools, I think, or the Thomas Jefferson School where you take it, and now they're changing it, but you take a test to get in. All of these exam schools around the country in Virginia, New York City, Stuyvesant, and then Lowell High School in San Francisco have historically been by exam and have had very small numbers of Black and Latinx students. Because of the pandemic, all of these schools have had to rethink. I mean, for years, advocates have been saying, this is, you know, I'm fair, the NAACP has put out lawsuits in some of these cases, but now those districts are like, all right, we got to do something. And so San Francisco just implemented a lottery for admission for the first time that is going to be for this coming fall. So it'll be really interesting to see. I think that, you know, how do students fare? My guess is that they're going to be just fine, right? And it will increase equity. It will diversify the student body. Those students will go on to have opportunities they otherwise wouldn't have had. So that's one example. I don't know of any examples in higher education. I've been pushing for it. So maybe one day I'll be able to say there is.
There is a push toward tuition free, of course.
Yeah.
And one or two colleges that are exclusively low income,
yep.
Not quite lottery, but certainly trying to address this talent initiative question. How do you get at talent when opportunity might not be present and the means might not be present?
Yeah.
So I'm going to read one comment, just a shout out kind of, that this person says, thank you, Professor Warikoo. I think it's very important for us to teach each other to view ourselves as human beings and to treat each other with respect. Everyone has a different perspective, experience, and it is important for us to learn from each other. Race and ethnicity is a very sensitive topic for everyone and can be very uncomfortable to discuss. I appreciate the work of the work that sociologists do to address racial disparities. Just a nice affirmation.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like those conversations are so important and we have to be able to discuss. Yeah.
And then I'll do one last one. This speaks to the question of classroom method, some of the solutions. Actually, maybe it's not a last one. There's another one popping in, but this one on classroom method that touches on some of the solutions you offered. Could you speak a bit about ways to empower more authentic dialogues in the classroom? This person is especially interested in developing tools so that students could venture into those braver spaces where they could hopefully be safe and feel like they can discuss race and social justice in deeper ways through deeper dialogue.
Yeah. So, I think one model, if people are interested in this, I would encourage you to look at, is called Intergroup Dialogue. It's a program that started out at University of Michigan, where they'll do things like this would be like a semester-long course. If let's say it's a class on race, they might have half the class is students of color, half the class is white students. And they, over the course of the semester, they build relationships and they read texts, and there's a real focus on discussion in a format that encourages kind of conversation. So I would definitely encourage people who are interested in this question to have a look at that model. I find it very compelling. But in general, I think it's important to create these spaces in classrooms where we can have this discussion. So I always tell my students, I come in, especially my classes that are on race or ethnicity, that we're going to come here and we're going to have some norms, right? That we're going to come to the conversation with an open mind. We're going to give each other the benefit of the doubt. We're going to say what we're thinking. We're not just going to hang back, because we're worried that someone's going to judge us, or that we're worried that someone's going to call us racist, or that someone's going to say that we're too, I don't know, students of color sometimes have this fear of, well, people are going to see me as, militant, and that's problematic, or I'm the only student of color. That we're going to come with and bring our whole selves to the conversation, give each other the benefit of the doubt, and we're going to stick with it, right? When it gets uncomfortable, we're not going to check out, right? And know that it's going to be uncomfortable, that at some point we're probably going to be offended or not like what someone said. At some point, we're probably going to offend somebody or, get someone upset. And all of that is okay, but we have to come back, we have to forgive and move on. And, I also recognize in this kind of request that it can place a larger burden on the students of color in those classes than on the white students because of their lived experiences. But for me, I feel like it's the only way I know forward to that we can do this in the classroom. It's a temporary space for us together with, a professor who's hopefully skilled at kind of coaching the conversation. And then, as you leave, you do what you need to do to take care of yourself, right? And that, we can't expect people to always be fully on in these spaces, in these kind of really intensive conversations. But those conversations are really important. And it's, it has to rest on building relationships so that people feel comfortable. I don't like to call it a safe space because, if you don't feel uncomfortable, I always tell students, if you never feel uncomfortable in my class, at the end of the semester, I'll be worried because I'll feel like nobody pushed you enough. So it's not about feeling comfortable, but it's about shifting your thinking. It's about pushing your thinking.
Yeah, I kind of wanted, there's a question from a person who's wondering about, again, back to the bargain, the diversity bargain, this sense that all of this is really just benefiting majority culture. This person feels as though some are just unwilling to learn, unwilling to move beyond their perspectives. Is it futile to try to teach people who choose ignorance and hatred? And I want to maybe give this person a little bit of hope. I'm wondering if you have an anecdote or something that you've experienced that gives us a sense that people do want to learn and evolve and, want to move from maybe a framework where they're thinking in less open terms, or they think in terms of colorblindness and are not thinking about history or not thinking about the ways that that history has baggage and that we're carrying this around still. I mean, what any hope that we can? I guess I'm just sort of grasping for something to tell this person.
I mean, I think when I think about the sort of rise of white nationalism, when I think about what happened in the Capitol last month, there are definitely people who I don't think are open to these conversations in this country. And, I think we've seen more than a few, kind of shockingly. So I think that's true. And that makes me, on the one hand, feel kind of very disgruntled and frustrated and so many feelings. But the way that I think about this work is this is how I think about social change in general, or when I work with teachers, talking about shifting the culture in their school, is forget about those people. You're not gonna change their, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in, the people who are here, let's move them over here, right? And so I think there are a lot of people who are interested in dialogue and open to thinking about these issues. I think, to me, that one of the biggest things about Black Lives Matter, when it first emerged, and then I think in this summer even more so, was that I think people of color have known that these issues exist for decades. I don't think it's anything new. But I think whites in the United States have really, a lot of people who hadn't thought about these issues before are now thinking about them and realizing that and have good intentions. And I think you can do a lot with that. And I think and that's the audience that I feel like I want to reach. And I think a lot of those people are on college campuses. And so I feel like we can do a lot. We can't do everything. I don't make any pretense about being able to, change the hearts and minds of people who are, full of racial hatred. But I think there are plenty of people who, have a colorblindness perspective, but have, are willing to be wrong and are open to dialogue and are starting to, for the first time, wake up to it's hard, the horrific racism that is the foundation of this country. So I think we're in a moment where there's real opportunity for change. So that's my hope, and that's my optimism, is I think there's will among a lot of people, and I think that's what we should focus on.
I've been reading a lot of James Baldwin, and there's a line from his last work where he's talking about theater and performance, and he says, "We are each other's flesh and blood." And I just absolutely love that in some ways, we're actually connected to each other in ways that are empowering and uplifting and can help us through very challenging topics and very challenging times. So, and his thought there was, in some ways, the art is just to represent what's there. He's not trying to come to solutions, and you have offered us solutions in ways that I didn't think you would necessarily. So I'm really appreciative that you did that in the last slide that you gave, and for all that you've given us today in conversation. So thank you very much. Again, I just kind of want to pause and let people give you a little round of applause that you can kind of feel and hear, though you're far, far away.
Thank you so much for having me, for all the comments in the chat. I'm having a hard time reading the chat while we're talking, but I know I'm looking too,
and also kind of pulling the chat in, and people are interested in other kinds of institutions. We talked about your books on elite institutions. Someone was asking about HBCUs and other kinds of institutions, but of course this work goes on. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real.
Before everyone goes, I just want to remind them of this being recorded, that if you want to view this or distribute it or share it with classes, with students, with friends, this will be available. And then also that on March 31st is our next webinar at 7 p.m. We're going to have artist Sabrina Nelson, and she's going to be in dialogue with Bert Ash, our professor in the English department in American Studies, and also Megan Driscoll, professor in art history, who will be leading the question and answer. So looking forward to that event as well, to think a little bit about art in this time and how art can help us to heal and to think through some of these things as well, to feel through some of these things as well. So thanks again, everyone. And thank you again, Professor Warikoo. And see you again next time, everyone. Bye-bye.